Continuing from part 1, here's part 2. Now I'd like to give a brief overview of how I designed the geometry, modified the Monte Carlo code, and ran the simulations. The geometry selected for the simulations was purely spherical. A photon point source was placed at the center of the geometry inside an air cavity. Surrounding the air cavity was a 5 mm thick shell containing some concentration of PNPs and water. The inner surface of the zone was considered at depth 0, or the starting point of the measurements. Surrounding that shell was a 25 mm thick shell containing only water. An additional 20 mm thick shell containing only water was placed on the outside for backscatter. The Monte Carlo code chosen for my simulations was the EGSnrc code. EGS stands for Electron Gamma Shower, and NRC stands for National Research Council of Canada, which is where the EGS code was created. EGSnrc is the current iteration of the EGS code and followed EGS4. EGSnrc is a multi-purpose MC code for radiation transport and has many different user code templates to choose from. The EGS user code I chose for my simulations was EDKnrc. EDK stands for Energy Deposition Kernel. Although the main purpose of this code was to calculate energy deposition kernels in addition to doses for cone geometry, spherical geometry, or a combination of the two, I only used it for dose distribution in a spherical geometry. The current iteration of EGS includes a very convenient graphic user interface, or GUI, where the user code is compiled and executed. Code compilation only needed to be done once per session unless the user code was modified. In addition, the PEGS tab allowed for creating custom media as shown here. Here, elements were input with their associated fraction weight, mass density, and energy ranges. The shown energy ranges were kept to be consistent with the ICRU 521 PEGS data, which is default. The AE and AP values are the electron and photon cutoff energies respectively, meaning when the particle's total energy is below that threshold, it will be locally absorbed in the program. Lower cutoff energies were tested, but I will discuss that momentarily. This is the execution tab and is where the PEGS file and the input file get selected. Then the start button is clicked and the GUI runs the simulations. Simple. Another implementation of the current iteration of EGS is the use of input files over having to modify the user code directly. The EGS input file, or EGSINF file, is a simple Mortran, which is a variation of Fortran, file that contains all of the input parameters you need. One input file for each simulation was made, and they were sequentially selected in the EGS GUI to run. Each EGS input file contained different sections for input parameters. The first section is the input-output control. This section is not very important as it was more concerned with multiple runs of the same simulation. The results used in this thesis are from single simulations. An input line for what kind of output file to print was included in the section 2, but modifying the value didn't seem to affect anything, so it was left alone. The next section in the EGS input file is the Monte Carlo inputs. This includes the number of histories to run. 500 million histories were run for the water-only simulations, while 1 billion histories were run for the PNPs. In retrospect, I would like to have run 1 billion sims for the water-only simulations as well. The Monte Carlo input section includes 2 inputs for initial random number generator seeds. These were left to their defaults. There is also a choice for which calculations would be formed by this code. Dose calculations were selected for this thesis, though EDK calculations were another option. Geometrical inputs in this section. Geometrical inputs is the section where I spent most of my time. A limitation of the code was having a finite number of radii I could input before the code wouldn't work right. To compensate for this limitation, I designed two types of shells, spacer shells and detector shells. Spacer shells were relatively thick shells put in between detector shells, which were 1 micron thick and approximated to have no volume. For the water-only simulations, the sum of the thicknesses of the spacer and detector shells was 0.5 millimeter. For the simulations with nanoparticles, the spacer shells varied in thicknesses near media interface to account for the interface effects. This section also contained inputs for the designation of each media in the system. The source input section contained inputs about that radiation source. Although all of the options are point sources, the type of ionizing radiation can be selected, as well as the direction in which the source radiates. An isotropically radiating point source of photons at the center of the system was selected. More advanced inputs are the MC transport parameters and variance reduction parameters. Most of these options were left default except for a few that were modified as recommended by the comments in the EGS input file or the EGS user code. Lastly, the plot control was left alone because I exported everything to Excel and made my own plots. Another bug forced me to modify the user code directly. This bug took a while to figure out and occurred when I had more than 65 shells. Dr. Egan recommended that I investigate the EDKnrc file itself, and I found two fields that contain the maximum number of radii allowed per simulation. I increased that amount from 65 radii to 150 radii, saved the file, and recompiled the EDK code in the EGS GUI. Although this seemed to work for any number of radii under 104, the 105th radius would result in a different too many shells bug. I was unable to correct this bug, however. 104 shells did prove to be enough for the purposes of this study, though. Simulations running 500 million histories in water only took about 35 minutes each to complete, while simulations with PNPs took quite a while longer, about 3 to 4.5 hours each. This was likely due to not only running double the number of histories, which requires more memory, but also the additional changes in media. After each simulation was run, the EGS GUI created an output file, the EGSLST file, which contained all of the pertinent information, including doses to each shell. And now for a summary of what my simulations found. Shown here are the results of the simulations containing water only with various inner cavity diameters. The lines and dots were made very small for this presentation in order to show the uncertainties output by the EGS code. We see what we normally expect to see in PDD curves of radiation dose in a single homogeneous medium, a decaying exponential curve. As evidence of that trend, I singled out the 3.5 cm diameter inner air cavity PDD data and fit a line to it. As we can see, the function is a decaying exponential, with an R-squared value of 0.9972, which indicates a statistically tight fit. I have to digress for a moment and talk about a certain close call I had. A couple of days ago, as I was writing this presentation, I had an epiphany about the electron and photon cutoff energies. It occurred to me how to lower them in the coding. This concept was discussed in multiple papers as well as suggested by Dr. Egan. However, it went right over my head and smacked me in the face while I was walking home from the plaid pantry. As the 10 keV cutoff energy seemed high for the 20 keV photon and electron kinetic energies, I wondered if the data I might have might be unusable, as electrons might have been depositing their energy in the wrong locations with respect to their actual stopping points. I'll admit, I panicked a little bit. I created a new PEGS data file, with a lowered electron and photon cutoff energies and ran 3 simulations with a 3.5 diameter air cavity surrounded by water only. As seen in the graph, the PDD curves are nearly indistinguishable from each other, and the subtle differences from point to point are well within the uncertainties given by EGS. In short, tweaking the electron and photon cutoff energies both in the PEGs file and the EGS input file had little, if any, effect, so I was able to relax. I attribute this to the scale of the system. A difference in kinetic energy of 10 keV shouldn't affect the range of the secondary electrons by that much. In addition, since the number of Compton scatter events is so low, a vast majority of the 20 keV photons were completely absorbed. Had the simulations been in the nanoscale or involved higher energies, I suspect this might have been more of an issue. Here we see the simulated results for both low to high Z and high to low Z interfaces. For these simulations, the first 5 mm of depth are water only, followed by a mixture of water and PNPs from 5 to 10 mm, and then water only again from 10 mm on. Recall that the ratio of the dose before and after an interface can be predicted by finding the ratio of the respective mass energy absorption coefficients. Those predictions were made and compared to what the simulations found. For the first interface, the predicted PDD increases were a bit higher than the simulated increases, and the proportional differences increased with PNP concentration. For the second interface, the predicted PDD decreases were lower than the simulated decreases. However, the differences were much smaller than the differences in the first interface. In short, there is some agreement between the predicted and the simulated PDD differences before and after each interface, which leads to some confidence in the simulation's ability to handle interfaces at the macro scale. On the other hand, the ability for the simulations to handle interface effects at the micro scale is not as apparent. Here I have zoomed in on the PDD for the 2% PNP concentration at the first interface. As we see an increase in a dose a few microns before the interface due to backscatter as expected. However, we see what looks like a tiny zone of buildup right after the interface. If we are assuming no buildup, that shouldn't be there. It is unclear if this is realistic, has to do with connecting the data points before and after the interface, or another reason. Zooming into the same PDD at the second interface, we see a sharp decrease in dose right before the interface, which shouldn't have happened to the extent that it does. All in all, the curves behave in a manner consistent with the mathematical modeling in the macro scale, but as the scale shrinks to the microscopic, it behaves different than what some studies have shown. This is the end of part 2.